We've been talking, of course, about COVID-19, about the coronavirus, the pandemic, and how it's affecting everybody, how it's changing everyone's lives, including mine and yours. I want to talk with my next guest about the populations of this world where they've been living under real wartime conditions for many, many years. And I think it's important not to lose sight of the fact that so far, everything we've experienced in this country, everything we're anticipated to experience, as grave as it is, pales next to the consequences of war. And my next guest knows something about war. I've been following his writing on this subject. He is insightful. He's fought in war. He has worked for the Pentagon. He is now a sane voice for war rethinking, I would say. And you should be reading him. If you're not, his name is Matthew Hoh, Hoh, and he joins us now. So first of all, Matthew, I guess I should also identify you as a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy, and welcome to the Zero Hour.
Hi, thanks, RJ. Appreciate it.
So, listen, you were deployed to the Middle East. I don't know how many years ago, but I have a feeling it's been a while now, and we've been there an F of a long time. And well, first thing I wanted to talk to you about, because I know you had some thoughts about it, and then maybe we can go broader, is before this pandemic hit, one of the news stories of the time was the Afghan peace process. And just, from 30,000 feet, maybe, what are your thoughts on what was going on there, what is going on in terms of that peace negotiations from the Trump administration?
Well, it's certainly the first opportunity for a peace process in Afghanistan since 1989. So for 30 years, there's been really no real or possible venue to see any type of long-term ceasefires, any type of power sharing agreements, any type of solution to the war that's been going on in Afghanistan since the 1970s. So, for the Afghan people, this is very important. I mean, I know there are various constituencies, there are various agencies, there are various individuals who would prefer to see this deal fall, and crash. However, for the Afghan people, as imperfect as the deal is, this is the best chance that they've had for peace, since the Soviet Union left. Those are talks that went on after the Soviet Union left, but they were more or less sabotaged by the United States, by the United States' insistence on continuing to fund the Islamist militant Mujahideen groups that we had been sponsoring in Afghanistan prior to the Soviet Union's invasion in 1979. So as an American, I think we also have this extra moral obligation, not just for the 20 years that we've been in Afghanistan with soldiers and aircraft and drones, et cetera, directly engaged in combat, but also, too, for all those years previous where Afghanistan was a proxy battlefield for the United States. So again, it is for me a hopeful opportunity, as imperfect as the deal is, for the Afghans to see some relief from 40 plus years of warfare.
Yeah, and I want to talk about that for a second. I'm glad you brought that up, Matthew, because there's a mythology, in my view, a mythology that's been spread that, well, these people have been fighting each other for 400 years. But
Yeah.
one of the multiple reasons why I'm at high risk right now for this virus is because I am able to remember a time when Afghanistan was not only peaceful, but a favored spot on the global hippie trail. When,
Uh-huh.
it was so peaceful and quote unquote mellow that, people went there to basically smoke opium and hang out and,
Yeah.
yeah,
You took the magic bus there, right?
well, I did not personally, but that was the preferred mode of transportation. And so this notion somehow that these people are other than us, different from us, more inherently warlike than us. In my view, complete fiction, right?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, and that's just not for the Afghans, but for all the greater Middle East. You know, if you include the middle, if you call it the greater Middle East and include it through North Africa and out to Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, um, the Muslim world basically, it has been a product of Western intervention, colonialism, the spillover of the effects of the Great Wars between the European powers, whether they be the wars of the 19th century or they be the First and Second World War. Yeah, I mean, if you look historically at these nations, as Afghanistan included, for the most part, they have not been at constant warfare as the mythology, as you cited, states. I mean, and again, not just for Afghanistan. If you look at, say, the history of Palestine, Palestine's relatively peaceful for centuries. It was only the intervention of the West, the Zionist movement, et cetera, that caused issues to form into this type of inter-ethnic, inter-religious, inter-sectarian violence. And so, yeah, absolutely. For up until 1973, for the 40 some odd years that the king reigned in Afghanistan, King Zahir Shah, the 40 years that he reigned or so, it was peaceful in Afghanistan. Yeah, they'd have issues, they'd have problems, but as long as the British weren't invading, as long as the Russians and Americans weren't treating Afghanistan as a playground for their own Cold War fantasies, Afghanistan was peaceful. And it's only when the king is overthrown in 1973 that you start to see the political turmoil that turns into chaos, that turns into the violence that precipitates the Soviet Union's invasion. I mean, the Soviets invaded in 1979. Prior to that invasion, 100,000 Afghans had already been killed in the fighting. So this idea that somehow what happened there was because the Soviet Union invaded is just not true. And the reality is that the United States was funding Islamist militant groups in Afghanistan starting early in 1979 as a plan hatched by Jimmy Carter and his national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, to bait the Soviet Union into a trap, to give the Soviet Union their own Vietnam. And of course, it worked. The Soviet Union fell into that trap and were there for nearly 10 years. It had their own Vietnam experience. But we're now, of course, globally suffering from the repercussions of that Carter Brzezinski strategy. And and of course, the Afghans have experienced nothing but suffering. But it's a good point you bring up, RJ, about this idea that these people, as is always is said, right? These people
Right.
have been fighting forever. It's just nonsense. It's not true. Europeans have a much more violent, warlike history than the Middle East does. If you listen to any historians on the subject.
And you'd think, Matthew Ho, that having sprung this evil trap, using the people of Afghanistan as prey, basically as what do you bait, for the
Yeah.
Soviet Union, regardless of the price of it, you'd think that at a minimum we would not be so effing stupid as to put our foot in the same trap ourselves, essentially. But I feel, in a sense, that that's what we did. That after 9/11, and we can talk about 9/11, what gave rise to it, and
Yeah.
the consequences of it. But it seems as if, didn't we learn that this is not terrain or a population in which a powerful empire can prevail through just gross military might?
I remember the day after 9/11, I was in the Marine Corps and I had been sent to Quantico to go to a school, and I was there with a friend of mine. And the day after 9/11, of course, the bases closed and everything, and schools canceled. And we were in a Waffle House, and we were talking about Afghanistan, and we had both read, a couple of books about the Soviet experience in Afghanistan. and as Marine Corps officers, not as special operations guys, just as regular combat arms, conventional warfare type of guys. I remember Jimmy and I having this discussion that we weren't going to see any of it because we would be exactly as you said, RJ, complete fools to replicate what the Soviet Union did in Afghanistan. But I mean, the people who run policy in the United States, the people who make these decisions, the last thing that they're beholden to is history. They're beholden to a host of other special interests, if you will, and history is not one of them. I mean, I would imagine if you went through, regardless, Democrat or Republican administration, you find very few history majors. And if you looked at the nightstands of what these people are reading on their own free time, very few of them are cracking open serious history on any type of matters, whether it be domestic or international policy. So I think that's one of the real problems is that our system just doesn't allow people who have real historical knowledge, who are wise, who make sane decisions to be at levels of responsibility. I mean, and that includes the United States military. Certainly, you have had these generals that are primary political generals. They've not won wars. They have only seen their strategies make the situations worse in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and in Syria, and in Libya, and throughout Africa and the Middle East. And so you when you get to know what these people are like, when you see them up close and personal, you understand how the system is beholden to moneyed interest, whether it's the weapons industry or the intelligence industry or the development industry, or it's the the career aspirations of generals who want to keep getting promoted. So the best way for them to get promoted is for these wars to go on and for them to get a shot to command, as well as too, then it's the ideologues, whether they be neoconservative or liberal interventionists. So whether they be like, John Bolton or Samantha Powers, who actually believe that American empire is the best thing for the planet and that the maintenance and the expansion of that empire is the primary responsibility of the executive branch. I mean, so when you have that all rolled up, it's really easy for those who would say, just as you did, my God, why the heck would you step into the quicksand? But they do. They don't just step into it; they jump into it with both feet. And it's I think why I think those of us who are realistic about it don't see a difference in the policies of what would be the policies of any of the presidential candidates when it comes to these wars, and that we kind of get a little bit hopeless, if we will, at the possibilities that these type, and it's interesting if you are a reader of historical works, and if you are like say looking at now like say something like Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, which is now 30 years old or so, which had a huge effect on so many members of the foreign policy establishment in the U.S., whether they be Democrat, Republican, or military, or intelligence, or wherever they reside. You do see that Huntington, as incorrect in my view as he was for how the world actually operates, his view seeped into these people's head ideologically, and that this idea that you're going to have these borderlands, right? These areas where there's going to be constant fighting on the edge of civilization, to paraphrase him, and that you're going to have to maintain and control those areas so that the bad effects of the borderlands don't spill over. And you could even see it too, if you want to reference back to COVID-19 and the pandemic, the way, say, President Trump is speaking about the pandemic, the way he calls it the China virus, right? I mean, this idea that the barbarians are at the gates and we need to be out there fighting them, isn't just a fixture, I think, of American military foreign policy, but a fixture of a lot of other policies.
No, I think it's totally correct. By the way, Matthew Ho, whenever I think of Huntington's Clash of Civilizations, I think of Mahatma Gandhi's answer when he was in England and the British press asked him what he thought of Western civilization. And he said, I think it would be a good idea. I think that, this notion that somehow we quote unquote, the westernized countries represent a level of civilized behavior that is higher, is, how shall I put it, contradicted by the evidence of our foreign and military policy.
Oh,
Your thought?
absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, and you saw this too. This was my concern and others' concern 3 years ago when Donald Trump was putting together his national security, administration, his national security people, and a good percentage of them were generals. You had General Kelly as chief of staff. You had General McMaster as national security advisor. He brought back General Mattis to be the Secretary of Defense. Had to get a special waiver from Congress to do that. Excuse me. Um, and I remember talking about this and writing a little bit about this, that there was a book, particularly that was required reading in the Marine Corps, but also for many Army officers as well, called "This Kind of War," and it was about a book about the Korean War, and it really kind of presages or predates Huntington in this idea that the United States always has to be ready to meet threats from not from abroad, not as if we have to defend our borders, but in order to defend our way of life, our quote Western civilization unquote, we have to go out to meet the threat. We have to meet them in the borderlands. It's almost as if it's like a scene from the Lord of the Rings films, right? That if you have to travel out to find where the orcs are being created and destroy it, And the reality is, though, the instability that is out there, the instability that is occurring, the chaos that is occurring, the civil wars, the genocides, the whatever you want to describe occurring in these, this arc. And it really is a world war. I mean, I tend to believe that we should be calling this World War III, because the number of nations that have in the last 20 years experienced war, going from Western Africa all the way through Pakistan, it's nearly every one of them have received. I mean, many of them have been completely devastated, left in ruin. So the idea that that we should continuing to separate what's happening, say, in Mali or what's happening in Kenya from what's happening in Yemen, from what's happening in Syria or what's happening in Afghanistan is, completely, I think, another aspect of Western hubris, racism, however you want, this colonialist mindset that still exists among us, because we can't see. And when I say we, of course, not, I'm sure most of the folks listening to us are in agreement with us, but we in the grander we of the United States and the West don't understand that these troubles, these problems, these wars are of our making. And there have been study after study, whether it's intelligence from the U.S. intelligence community, whether it be from the United Nations, whether it be work done by journalists or academics, that shows over and over again that the reason why people are joining these, for the most part, Islamist militant groups, is that they are doing it because they are occupied, they feel threatened by a predatory government, they've seen friends, neighbors, relatives killed or grievously harmed by foreign powers or by a government backed up by foreign powers. And who do they turn to? They turn to those who are already willing to fight and who've got an established system and organization. And so you see, whether it be Boko Haram in Western Africa, Al-Shabaab in Eastern Africa, whether it be the Taliban, our own intelligence, and this is whether it be intelligence I read 10 years ago when I was still doing that kind of work, or just stuff that has been leaked out by WikiLeaks or confirmed by the UN or other studies. These men and women are fighting us because we are occupying them. So the idea that in the West we are somehow more advanced, that our civilization is somehow better, and many also too. There's also the idea of the white man's burden, right? This thing that goes back to Kipling and British Empire, that we have to, as white people, as a more advanced race, we have to help our less fortunate brown and black and yellow brothers and sisters, right? So it's still prevalent. It's still within the mindset of major American policymakers still well within the officer ranks of the U.S. military, certainly within the officer ranks of the United Kingdom or the Israeli military. And so it's very important to understand this. And you can see too. I mean, I could certainly see when I was in the Marine Corps and with the State Department and just being around it for all these years, that the mindset that there's no way, and this is something that the American military experienced in the Vietnam War and the Korean War and the Native American wars, et cetera, that these people, these brown people, can fight us, can keep up with us, can deal with us. And so, I think that's one of the reasons, a major reason that U.S. military policy has failed so spectacularly is because there's just been a complete lack of respect, let alone understanding of the adversary.
And Matthew Ho, this is so interesting to me because I think we need to be exploring this even in the context of the pandemic emergency, our own psychology for looking to certain role models, certain ways of reacting. You mentioned the generals around Trump when he first took office. And also, by the way, how whoever gets elected, that at least in terms of military and foreign policy, things might look very much the same. I think that one of the things that's been striking to me, and since the election of Trump, has been the sort of celebratory nature of a lot of Democrats' responses to his initially surrounding himself with generals. I'm thinking of, MSNBC political figures and so on. I'm thinking of, the adults in the room, right? I mean, the
That's
idea,
right.
there's this childlike sense of the generals are more adult, or they're authority figures. Oh, thank God we can rely on them. Maybe more so, candidly, among Democrats than Republicans as a rule. I don't know, but I do know one of my closest friends who died recently was much older, fought in World War II, had much the same politics I do, and I'll clean up his language a little bit, but he said, part of this problem comes because most Democrats have never been in the service. When we all served, we knew what effing idiots they all were. And now that may be a bit ungenerous, but at least they were not mythologizing that somehow John Kelly, I'll just pick a couple of Kelly, Flynn, whomever, what, you people are surprised you didn't read anything about these people while they were generals. It seems, I love your thoughts on it, but it seems to me that this sort of impulse, which even after those guys have shown their true colors, despicable in my view, this impulse to say, well, the generals will tell us what to do, is a kind of liberal authoritarianism.
Absolutely. There's a deification of the military where it has achieved like a paraclerical status, where it's blasphemous to question what the military says. It's blasphemous to criticize the military. Who are you to, say, General so-and-so, who are you to criticize them? And, this brings up one of my favorite quotes. It was Susan Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower's granddaughter tells it, that supposedly towards the latter part of his time in office, Dwight Eisenhower was standing, and had been the commander of Allied forces in Europe during the Second World War. I mean, this was a man who knew these things, was standing in the Oval Office, and he looked at the chair in the office, and he said out loud, President Eisenhower said, "I pity this country, or I fear for this country, when a man sits in this chair who does not know the military as well as I do." And he wasn't talking about that, the president of the United States needs to be a strategist or needs to understand military tactics or needs to have operations or logistics experience or anything like that. What he was talking about was that you need to understand that the generals and admirals lie all the time. that's what they do. They lie. And Eisenhower knew it, and he spent. If you read, say, the books by Andrew Bacevich, Bacevich talks a lot about uh, 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 Eisenhower's time in office. And Eisenhower spent a lot of his time fighting against the military. I mean, certainly you could look at the expansion of, say, the nuclear program, nuclear weapons program under Eisenhower, and some other aspects of Eisenhower's presidency that we look back now and find them lacking. But however, he did spend a lot of his time trying to keep the generals and admirals from starting a third world war. And
Right.
so just as your friend says, the this idea that somehow these men and women, and it's mostly men, are somehow infallible is laughable. I mean, it's just not true. It's the opposite. Most of them are, I mean, what I say about it, and I went to war 3 times. That the best. I have a bunch of books I always recommend, but like if you want to understand war generally, the best 2 books to read are Catch 22. And the Matt and the book Match, the book that inspired the movie and the television series. And those 2 books will give you a good idea of what the U.S. military and most militaries, I assume, are realistically like. That it is not this sharp-edged, finely honed instrument of war, but rather a military that wins or tries to win simply by wasting more than the other side. So wasting more bullets, wasting more bombs, wasting more jet fuel, wasting more lives. That's the American way of warfare. And unfortunately for the United States military, when it comes up against, say, an insurgency like it has so many times, going back to the Native American wars, it finds that such type of tactics and operations and strategy are not effective when you're actually dealing against an adversary that is basing its part of the war on will and the power of will. But this is all principles of warfare that have existed for centuries that American military planners and American military and generals and admirals push aside because that's not anything that's going to help them in their careers. It's not going to help them in their own commands, what they actually command at the time. And it is problemsome and it's troublesome and it offers only resistance to them succeeding in their specific job as a general or as an admiral. And I'll give you an example of kind of what I'm talking about. So Curtis LeMay, who was the head of the U.S. Bomber Command during the Second World War, responsible, for the bombing of Europe, and then he moved over and was responsible for the bombings of Japan. And then he became head of the Strategic Air Command after that and was responsible for building, really, the American nuclear arsenal on the Air Force side. And one day he had a subordinate who said to him, he said something along the lines of, General LeMay, and he referenced the Soviet Union. This young man referenced the Soviet Union as the enemy. And he said, and General LeMay supposedly said, hey, let me stop you right there, son. Russia, or the Soviet Union, is an adversary. The Navy is the enemy. And so, you have to understand that, that's the reality of Washington, D.C. That's the reality of the Pentagon. That's the reality of most organizations, is that they are inward focused, and whether it be for their own personal benefit or for the benefit of what they own, in this case, say Curtis LeMay's Strategic Air Command, what he wanted to see prosper, and so the idea that the degree of empathy needed, the degree of understanding, the degree of respect needed for the outside is very limited when it comes to the actual way the American military and the foreign policy establishment operates. And so and this is how, one more reason why you can look at the last 20 years and say, my God, why does these wars just keep going? And there are lots of reasons for it. But one of the reasons is you just have to understand that when you have a $1 trillion military, which is basically, according to Bill Hartung, who is a colleague of mine at the Center for International Policy, according to Bill, actual U.S. military spending this year is about $1.2 trillion when you add in everything related to the military. So including the cost of paying for veterans, include the cost of paying for interest on past military spending, because we're paying for everything on a credit card, basically, right? As well as the Pentagon budget and the budget for the intelligence agencies and the budget for nuclear weapons. It comes to about $1.2 trillion. And when you have an organization that's large, a $1 trillion organization, you're going to have this inertia that exists. And so whether you want to call it the deep state or whatever you want to call it, it exists, and it continues to propel this machine, this war machine. And unless you get somebody in there like a Dwight Eisenhower who has the knowledge, the courage, and the political capital to put some brakes on it, I have no doubt that next year it'll be a $1.3 trillion organization, the following year $1.4 trillion, and the wars will just keep going, because that's what's best for the admirals and the generals, for the ideologues, for the weapons companies, et cetera.
Yeah, and that's, you made the segue I was going to make, Matthew Ho, which was to the money. And I guess a couple thoughts before we go on. If I recall correctly, if General Curtis LeMay had his way during the Cuban Missile Crisis, we would have gone nuclear in that conflict.
Yeah.
So it shows a certain level of insanity. And the last thing
not just him. It was a large portion of the senior generals and admirals in the U.S. military. It's one of the things that pushes John Kennedy and his brother Robert to start to distance themselves from conventional thinking along the lines of, listening to the military, because of how reckless, for lack of a better word, they were during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it wasn't just Curtis LeMay, but it was a number of the senior generals and admirals. And I'm not sure how many of the, there are 6 men who are on the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure a majority of them were in favor of going nuclear too.
It's insane. And just maybe as a final thought, that we can't discount, in my view, the fact that the real payoff for a senior military career these days seems to be with Raytheon or one of the other defense contractors, with the side benefit of the status and public recognition that goes along with being a regular guest on CNN or MSNBC, usually without being identified as to your conflict of interest when it comes to escalating military intervention. That's my view, but I'll give you the last word.
No, you're absolutely correct. General Dumford, who had been the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and who was very much behind, say, various weapon programs, including some that are part of Lockheed Martin's portfolio, is now on the board of Lockheed Martin. Yeah, the revolving door. It's something like 70 to 80% of generals go to work for the weapons industries when they retire. It is, and they're not being hired because they're being hired for their Rolodex, or I'm sorry, using kind of an antiquated term there, but they're being hired for their contact information. Because this way they want to keep selling weapons, and as well as the fear, the real fear among politicians to be seen as critical towards the military. Whether or not, if you ever watch on C-SPAN the House Armed Services Committee hearings or Senate Armed Services Committee hearings, and those members that are present, both Democrat and Republican, with a few exceptions, will look like bobblehead dolls. They are literally just bobbing their heads up and down in agreement with whatever the generals and admirals say. So the revolving door is very real. I'm sure it's real for all aspects of industry. Certainly between, say, big agriculture and our agriculture department. You're going to have it. But among the defense industry, it's really insidious, because the end result, of course, is the killing that continues to take place daily. And you look at it. You look at all the trillions of dollars we've spent on bombs and jet planes and rifles and sending men and women overseas to kill, and then we don't have enough ventilators and masks and et cetera here at home to actually protect us from a real threat. So there is a insanity to it, just a otherworldly insanity that's really hard for a rational person to wrap their head around.
So in the minute we got left, you think this vast complex is going to be able to stop a peace deal in Afghanistan?
Certainly, they're going to do everything they can to try. I mean, you see it with whether it's getting Democratic candidates, or not Democratic candidates, but Democratic members to voice concern, as they would call it, about the peace deal. Members like Chris Murphy of Connecticut, certainly they will call upon those that they can always rely upon, like Liz Cheney of Wyoming, and they will do whatever they can to make it appear to President Trump that and this is the same thing they did to President Obama, if any terrorist attack occurs, they will link it to Afghanistan, no matter how, no matter, even if there is no evidence, even if the evidence points to anything else, they will link it to Afghanistan to politically destroy them. And the idea that if someone blows up Times Square or somebody blows up an airliner or whatever, that the conversation will be, is this because Donald Trump pulled out of Afghanistan? And that's a very real fear it was both a fear of President Obama, and I'm sure it's a conversation that President Trump has. And I am by far no Donald Trump supporter, but in this matter, I do support him, and I do think we need to give him as much political capital and as much political support as we can, as awful as his other policies may be, to support this type of change in terms of pursuing some kind of peace process for Afghanistan.
Well, Matthew Hoh, HOH, Senior Fellow at the Center for International Policy, thanks for all your great work and your great thinking in this area, and thanks for coming on the program.
Well, thank you for having me. I appreciate it. And